Top 5 Spine-Chilling Stories for the Brave, Strange Edition. Hey everyone! Today, I've got something really special for you. We're diving into a collection of 5 captivating stories. The first one is completely new, while the other 4 are fan favorites that remind us just how much stranger the truth can be than fiction. These 4 beloved stories have been freshly edited for today's episode, so even if you think you've heard them before, trust me, this will feel like a brand new experience. But before we jump into these 5 incredible stories, if you're a fan of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, all wrapped up in storytelling, you're definitely in the right place. That's what we do here. We upload a new video every week, so if that sounds good to you, the next time you see that like button, give it a little nudge. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications, so you won't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's dive into today's stories. On the evening of January 13, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff stepped into his studio apartment in New York, Delaware. He had just come back from visiting his grandmother, but now he was feeling really under the weather. As he entered, he noticed that it was blazing hot inside, though that was just how he liked it. Ronald took off his coat and tossed it over one of the many handmade wooden cages scattered around his living room. Next, he dragged himself over to the house phone, picked it up, and called the auto dealership where he worked. When the office manager answered, Ronald informed her that he wouldn't be able to make it to work the next day because he was feeling really sick. After hanging up, he leaned on the counter for a moment, feeling lightheaded. Suddenly, from behind him, he heard a hissing sound. Startled, Ronald turned around and walked over to his fridge. Instinctively, he reached out with his right hand to open the door, but as soon as he grabbed the handle and squeezed, a sharp pain shot through his right hand. He had completely forgotten that his hand was all bandaged up from an injury. Grimacing, Ronald switched to his left hand and opened the fridge that way. After shutting the fridge, he walked over to the kitchen counter, reached into a jar, and pulled out a whole handful of live cockroaches. Each one was about 2 inches long, wriggling around in his hand. He tossed the cockroaches onto the floor and watched as they scattered in every direction. With that little chore out of the way, Ronald figured he'd just lay down for a bit since he was feeling so awful. But as he crossed the kitchen toward his bedroom, the dizziness from earlier hit him again. Suddenly, it felt like the whole world was spinning, and he could barely keep himself upright. He kept trying to make it to his bedroom, but his legs just wouldn't cooperate. Eventually, he stumbled and began to fall. In a desperate attempt to catch himself, Ronald lurched sideways and blindly reached out to his right. The first thing his hand touched was the door to his apartment. He grabbed it, trying to steady himself, but it didn't help. So he turned his body and pressed his back against the door, hoping to regain his balance. But he was just so woozy and weak that eventually, Ronald slumped down to the ground, leaning against the door with his feet stretched out in front of him. Slowly, he let his eyes drift closed. As he passed out, all he could hear were the sounds of roaches scurrying around and the crunching of chicken bones. 3 days later, Ronald's neighbor heard the crackle of police walkie-talkies in the hallway. Curious, he opened his door and saw 2 police officers and the building's superintendent standing in front of Ronald's door. This neighbor liked Ronald. He knew him to be a nice, quiet guy, so he couldn't imagine why the police would be at his apartment. But then he realized he hadn't seen Ronald in several days. The neighbor watched as the police officers knocked on Ronald's door, waiting for him to come out, but it never opened. After a few minutes of knocking with no response, the officers stepped back and gestured for the superintendent to come forward and use his key to open the door. After the superintendent opened the door, the neighbor watched as the police officers tried to push it open, but they couldn't. It was like something really heavy was blocking it from the other side. Finally, both officers leaned against the door with enough force that it creaked open just a crack. The neighbor saw the officers stick their heads into the apartment, only to jump back, hands hovering over their guns. One of the cops quickly grabbed his radio and began frantically relaying something. Then, the neighbor watched as the officers and the superintendent hurried down the hallway, disappearing from sight, leaving Ronald's apartment door partially ajar. As the neighbor heard the wail of sirens outside, He cautiously stepped into the hallway and realized he could see into Ronald's apartment through the open door. What he saw inside was so horrifying that, for a moment, he just froze. Then, a second later, he backed away into his own apartment and slammed the door shut behind him. Hours later, the image of what he had seen in Ronald's apartment was burned into his mind. He grabbed a piece of paper and began sketching the bizarre scene. Turned out Ronald had a secret. And on the evening of January 13, 2002, right after Ronald had called in sick to work, that secret cost him his life. Here is the picture that the neighbor drew of what he saw inside Ronald's apartment. On the floor lay Ronald's lifeless body. His face, ears, hands, and internal organs had all been consumed. Surrounding him were the giant monitor lizards he had been secretly keeping as pets. He had 7 of them, which he fed roaches and raw chicken, letting them roam freely throughout his apartment. They ranged in size from 2 to 6 feet long, massive creatures, indeed. Unfortunately for Ronald, monitor lizards are not just carnivores. Their mouths are also filled with deadly bacteria. The reason his right hand was bandaged up is that, a week before his death, one of his lizards had bitten him, and the bacteria from the bite led to a horrible staph infection. It was that staph infection that likely caused Ronald to pass out inside his apartment, leaving him vulnerable to his pets. After he lost consciousness, the lizards turned on him. While it's assumed he died from the infection before they began to consume him, the autopsy couldn't confirm this. It's possible he may have still been alive when they started eating him. After Ronald's tragic death, his lizards were removed from his apartment and relocated to the Catoctin Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Thomont, Maryland. Both of them had been shot multiple times and were drenched in blood. You can see in the basement where some of the fur had been scraped off, and the floor was also covered in blood. From a young age, Gareth Williams's parents recognized his extraordinary talent. By just 17 years old, he had already earned a first-class honors degree in mathematics from a university in his hometown in Wales. A couple of years later, he completed his PhD at the University of Manchester in England. Following that, he was accepted into a postgraduate program at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Cambridge. However, he wouldn't finish that degree because his remarkable academic achievements caught the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies, who began recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, commonly known as GCHQ, offered him a position as a codebreaker. Eager to take on this opportunity, he accepted the job, dropped out of Cambridge, and moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, a resort town about 88 miles from London, where GCHQ is located. There, he would live and work for the next 10 years. Despite being an intensely private and shy individual, Gareth was a highly valued team player. His genius in mathematics and technology contributed significantly to his group, helping them win several of Britain's top awards for international codebreaking. In 2009, another of Britain's major intelligence agencies, the renowned Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 for short, was so impressed with Gareth that they extended an offer for him to come work with them. This was a rare opportunity for Gareth to go operational and become a spy in the Hollywood sense of the word, effectively a real-life James Bond. He eagerly jumped at the chance. However, shortly after starting the job and moving to London, he began to regret his decision. He found the intense competitiveness at MI6 overwhelming, along with the flashy cars, extravagant lifestyles, and the pressure to party with coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody minded his preference for solitude, but at MI6, this attitude made him feel like an outsider. Before leaving MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation ended, he didn't return to his office in London. For some reason, MI6 never checked in on Gareth to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called the police after not hearing from him that anyone looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer arrived at Gareth's apartment in London to perform a welfare check. After knocking on the door and getting no response, the officer obtained a key from the landlord and went inside. He called out for Gareth but found no sign of him on the first floor. So he headed upstairs, continuing to yell for him as he went. Upon reaching the second floor, he discovered a closed door. What he found on the other side would make international headlines for weeks to come. When he opened the door, he stepped into a bathroom. At first glance, everything seemed normal, until he noticed a large red duffel bag in the bathtub. Inside that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the duffel bag was padlocked shut from the outside, with the key to the padlock found underneath Gareth's body inside the bag. There were no fingerprints on the rim or inside the bathtub, nor on the bag itself, the two zippers, the padlock, or the keys. Nearby, Gareth's iPhone was discovered sitting on a table, but it had been factory reset. Investigators later determined that it had been reset on August 15th, the last day he was seen on CCTV footage and also believed to be the day he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body showed no signs of injury or struggle, and his toxicology report indicated that he had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat in Gareth's apartment was cranked up high, making it very hot inside, even though it was the height of summer in August. This excessive heat sped up the decomposition process, making it impossible to determine the exact cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by the police, there was no conclusive answer as to what exactly happened to Gareth, though many theories emerged. One theory suggests that the Russian mafia was involved in his death. Just before he died, Gareth had been focused on money laundering cases in Britain that were linked to the Russian mafia, which would have made him a target. Another theory posits that MI6 may have had something to do with Gareth's death, which could explain why they were not eager to investigate when he didn't return from his vacation. In fact, a former MI6 agent has publicly stated his belief that a cover-up occurred. He was interviewed by CNN and claimed it appeared that MI6 had entered Gareth's apartment before the police arrived, wiping it down and removing fingerprints and DNA evidence. The last prominent theory suggests that Gareth may have taken his own life. Investigators discovered that he had made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least once, he had to call out to his landlord for help because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't free himself. When two experts involved in the investigation tried to replicate the scenario by putting themselves into a similar-sized duffel bag and locking it from the outside with the padlock, they were unable to do so, despite attempting it over 400 times. Even if Gareth had somehow managed to get himself inside the bag and lock it from the outside, it raised the question of how he could have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, the lock, the zippers, and the bathtub. After all, when he was found, he wasn't wearing gloves. Ultimately, despite the numerous red flags, Gareth's death was classified as probably an accident, and the case was closed 3 years after his death. Growing up, Pauline Dacon always sensed that something was off about her family. Years later, she would discover just how right she was. In 1970, when Pauline was just 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. For Pauline, it wasn't much of a shock. Her father, Warren, was a heavy drinker and extremely violent. After the separation, Pauline, her mother, and her brother moved into a different house on the other side of Vancouver, Canada. However, Pauline began to notice that her mom started acting really anxious all the time, though she never understood why. When Pauline was 9, her mother told her and her brother that they were going on a vacation to Winnipeg, which is about 1,000 miles away from Vancouver, to visit her mom's family. Pauline was thrilled at the idea of this trip and couldn't wait to see her cousins, so she eagerly packed her suitcase, and they headed to the airport. When they arrived in Winnipeg, Pauline and her brother said goodbye to their mom, who waved to them as they passed through airport security. They then boarded their flight. However, while they were on the plane, a flight attendant called for Pauline to come to the back. Curious, she went back and was surprised to see her mom there, holding a big cardboard box labeled with Pauline's name. With a smile, her mom said, "It's just a present." After that, she walked off the plane as it prepared for takeoff. For 9-year-old Pauline, it was a really strange experience, but she was thrilled to receive this surprise gift. She returned to her seat beside her brother, feeling happy. Once they landed, they headed to their aunt's house on the other side of Winnipeg, which was absolutely beautiful. Once they settled in, their aunt brought out Pauline's present from her mom. Pauline was bursting with excitement to open it, but when she did, she found a big stack of empty photo albums. Confused and a bit disappointed, she thought maybe her mom had simply forgotten to put pictures in the albums and would send them later. Despite this letdown, Pauline and her brother enjoyed the rest of their vacation in Winnipeg, spending quality time with their aunt and cousins. Pauline assumed her mom would send her those pictures for the albums later. But months went by, and she still hadn't received anything. As it turned out, her mom hadn't simply forgotten to include the photos. She had taken all the pictures out of those albums, the ones that captured moments of her whole family, including those of Pauline and her brother, and thrown them away. Instead of sending them later, she placed the empty albums in the box and asked the flight attendant to deliver it to Pauline at the airport, hoping the gift would bring her some joy. Deep down, she wanted to distance herself from her kids, thinking that would help her forget about them. What Pauline didn't know was that her mom was actually very sick when she made that decision. Pauline's mom had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. During her psychotic episodes, she struggled with delusions, convinced she was a bad mother who had failed her kids and made their lives worse. Sending the box with all the empty albums was her way of expressing that she felt she had truly failed as a mom and believed she deserved to be abandoned. Sadly, Pauline's mother never received the help she needed and continued to spiral deeper into her psychosis. A year later, she took her own life. As Pauline grew older, she would learn that she wasn't the only one in her family affected by schizophrenia. Her brother would eventually be diagnosed with the same condition. It turned out that both Pauline and her brother were showing symptoms of schizophrenia. Their mother had been trying to keep it a secret, doing everything she could to hide the fact that her children were struggling with this illness. Unfortunately, she ultimately failed, and schizophrenia would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. Now, while the stories you just heard are quite grim, it's essential to remember that they are just stories. These events did happen, but they represent only a small part of a much larger picture. There's so much more to these stories, and it's impossible to convey the full scope of their experiences. I'm actually doing a podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, where I dive deep into some of the most bizarre, strange, and mysterious stories I can find, offering context and perspective along the way. If that sounds interesting to you, head over to my podcast and be sure to subscribe. Before we jump into the stories, I want to remind you to check in on your loved ones, even if you haven't seen them in a while. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious presented in story format, you're in the right place. We upload once a week, so let's get into today's stories. On the evening of January 13th, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff stepped into his studio apartment in New York, Delaware. He had just returned from a visit to his grandmother, but now he felt overwhelmingly unwell. The heat inside his apartment was stifling, an intentional choice as Ronald preferred it that way. After shedding his coat, he tossed it over one of the many handmade wooden cages scattered throughout the living room. Feeling weak, he made his way to the phone and called the auto dealership where he worked. When the office manager picked up, Ronald informed her that he wouldn't be able to come in the next day due to his illness. He hung up the phone and leaned heavily against the counter, feeling lightheaded. Just then, a sudden hiss broke the silence behind him. Ronald turned, drawn instinctively to the fridge. Reaching out with his right hand to open the door, he was jolted by a sharp pain. He had forgotten his hand was bandaged, still nursing an injury. Grimacing, he switched to his left hand and managed to pull the fridge door open. After shutting it, Ronald ambled over to the kitchen counter. He reached into a jar and pulled out a handful of live cockroaches, each about 2 inches long, wriggling and squirming in his grasp. With a swift motion, he tossed them onto the ground and watched as they scattered in all directions, disappearing into the shadows of his cluttered apartment. Now that Ronald had finished his chores, he decided to lie down, hoping to escape the relentless nausea that had plagued him all day. But as he crossed the kitchen toward his bedroom, the dizziness returned with a vengeance. The world around him spun violently, each rotation blurring the edges of his vision. He felt as if he was trapped in a twisted funhouse mirror, where everything was distorted and moving at an impossible pace. He struggled to take even a single step, his legs wobbling beneath him like a newborn foal. With every attempt to reach his sanctuary, the ground seemed to shift and tilt, making him feel as though he was going to topple over at any moment. Eventually, gravity won out, and he stumbled, the world tilting away from him. In a frantic effort to catch himself, Ronald lurched sideways, reaching out blindly. His fingers brushed against the cold surface of his apartment door. Desperate, he grabbed the handle and tried to steady himself, but it was futile. With a resigned sigh, he turned and pressed his back against the door, feeling the rough wood against his skin. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor, his breath shallow and ragged, hoping the spinning would subside. Overcome by exhaustion and a profound sense of weakness, Ronald finally slouched down against the door, his feet sprawling out in front of him. His eyelids grew heavy, the darkness creeping in as he surrendered to unconsciousness. As he drifted away, the only sounds that filled his ears were the faint scurrying of cockroaches and the unsettling crunch of chicken bones, a stark reminder of his unorthodox household. 3 days passed in eerie silence until a crackle of police walkie-talkies pierced the stillness of the hallway. The sound stirred Ronald's neighbor from his thoughts, prompting him to open his door. Peering out, he was met with an unsettling sight. 2 police officers standing rigidly, flanking the superintendent of their building, all of them positioned in front of Ronald's door. The neighbor's heart sank. He had always regarded Ronald as a kind, quiet man, someone who kept to himself but was always friendly enough. The image of police at his door sent a chill down his spine. Why would they be here? What could possibly have happened? A sense of foreboding washed over him, and he felt an involuntary shiver run through him as he stood there, anxiously awaiting what would unfold next. The neighbor's mind raced as he recalled the last time he had seen Ronald. Had it really been that long? A knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. As he watched the police officers knock firmly on Ronald's door, the rhythmic sound echoed down the hallway, a stark contrast to the eerie stillness that enveloped the building. Each knock was met with silence, and an unsettling feeling began to creep over him. Minutes dragged on, and the police exchanged glances, their faces a mix of concern and determination. Finally, one of the officers stepped back and gestured for the superintendent to approach. With a deep breath, the superintendent took out his key and inserted it into the lock. The sound of the key turning felt like a countdown, and the neighbor braced himself, anticipation mounting. Once the door swung open, the neighbor leaned forward, his heart racing. The officers moved to push the door open wider, but to his astonishment, it wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force held it shut, an overwhelming weight that made it impossible to enter. The officers strained against the door, their shoulders pressing hard against it, but still it remained stubbornly closed. The tension in the hallway thickened as the officers exchanged looks of confusion. What on earth could be blocking the door? The neighbor's curiosity morphed into dread, and he took an involuntary step back, his instincts warning him that something was terribly wrong. The eerie silence of the hallway felt suffocating as the neighbor stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the air thick with dread and uncertainty. As the police officers retreated, their expressions a mix of shock and urgency, the neighbor couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Curiosity overwhelmed his fear, and he took a cautious step toward the open door. Peering inside, he was met with a nightmarish sight that made his stomach churn. Ronald's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, a gruesome tableau that sent a jolt of terror through him. The sight was so horrifying that it felt surreal, like a twisted scene from a horror movie. Surrounding him were enormous monitor lizards, their scaled bodies glistening under the dim light as they moved with unsettling ease. The realization hit him like a punch. Ronald had been keeping these massive creatures as pets, but what had happened? The lizards, once mere curiosities he had seen slithering around the apartment, were now ravenous and terrifying, their predatory instincts unleashed. Panic coursed through him as he imagined the horrific events that must have transpired. Unable to bear the sight any longer, the neighbor stumbled back, slamming the door of his own apartment shut as if to block out the horror that had invaded his mind. Hours later, the image of Ronald's gruesome fate continued to haunt him, refusing to fade away. It replayed in his mind like a chilling movie on repeat, each detail etched into his memory. Desperate to process what he had witnessed, he grabbed a piece of paper and began to sketch. Each line was an attempt to capture the bizarre and terrifying scene he had stumbled upon. He sketched the lizards, their beady eyes glinting with an unsettling intelligence, and the body of Ronald, his features distorted in death. As he drew, the enormity of the situation sank in. Ronald had kept a dark secret hidden behind the walls of his apartment. The image of the scaly beasts and the chilling silence echoed in his mind. What had driven Ronald to this? What had gone so horribly wrong? The sketch would serve as a haunting reminder of that fateful day, a day that shattered the ordinary facade of their lives and exposed the terrifying truth lurking just beneath the surface. As the chilling reality of Ronald's death began to settle, it painted a haunting picture of the final moments in his apartment. On the evening of January 13, 2002, after he called in sick, he fell victim to the very secret he had harbored within those four walls. The neighbor's sketch, now a chilling artifact of that horrific scene, depicted a grotesque tableau. Ronald's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, his features contorted in a grotesque mask of pain and horror. His ears, face, and hands were gruesomely gnawed away, the remains of what once was a man now reduced to a mere shell, consumed by the very creatures he had cared for in secrecy. Surrounding him were the giant monitor lizards, their scales reflecting the dim light, eyes glinting with a primal hunger. 7 of these formidable beasts roamed freely in his apartment, ranging in size from 2 feet to an alarming 6 feet long. They were not mere pets. They were predators, wild creatures whose instincts lurked just beneath their domesticated facade. The gruesome scene spoke of a brutal reality. Monitor lizards, carnivorous by nature, are equipped with deadly bacteria in their saliva. Ronald's hand, bandaged from a recent bite, was a grim reminder of the danger he had invited into his life. The infection that had taken hold of him, a severe staph infection, had likely left him weak and disoriented. It was this infection that may have caused him to collapse, succumbing to the darkness that engulfed him in his moment of vulnerability. In those last moments, it was unclear whether he was fully aware of his fate or whether he had already slipped into unconsciousness, leaving him defenseless against the primal instincts of his pets. The autopsy could not conclusively determine if he was alive when the lizards began their grisly feast. The uncertainty lingered like a dark shadow over the tragedy, intensifying the horror of the event. After Ronald's death, the monitor lizards were removed from the apartment, their fate uncertain. They were taken to the Catachan Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Themont, Maryland, where they would live out their days far from the chaos of urban life. The sheer brutality of Ronald's demise haunted everyone involved, from the police officers who had stumbled upon the scene to the neighbors who had known him as a quiet, unassuming man. The basement of Ronald's apartment complex was a grisly reminder of what had transpired. Blood smeared across the floor told tales of a violent struggle, though it was uncertain whether Ronald had fought back or if the lizards had simply been acting on instinct, driven by hunger and survival. Scratches on the walls revealed their frantic movements, seeking escape from the horror that unfolded within the apartment. In the aftermath, those who had known Ronald grappled with the chilling reality of his secret life, the darkness that had lurked behind closed doors, and the tragic end that had come all too soon. The story of Ronald Huff serves as a haunting reminder of how quickly life can unravel, and how the secrets we keep may ultimately lead to our downfall. The stories you've just heard are fragments of sorrow, mystery, and unimaginable situations. From the enigmatic death of Gareth Williams, a genius caught up in unforeseen forces, to the heartbreaking tale of Pauline Dacon, who endured the family turmoil caused by mental illness, and finally, the horrific end of Ronald Huff, a lonely man devoured by the very lizards he kept. Each story is not just a tale of death or personal tragedy. They are reminders of the fragility of life, the secrets we may conceal, and the consequences that our choices can bring. Let us always remember that amid the mysteries and pain, the connections we share and the love we hold for those around us are of utmost importance. Don't forget to take time for your loved ones, for every moment can be meaningful. Keep yourself and others close, for no one can predict what may happen in the dark.